Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is a special program that focuses on everything Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in order to explain, especially the one thing that created such a narrative in order to bring a dichotomy between Ethiopia and the upstream countries, especially the 1959 agreement that brought about a partial and kind of biased agreement in order not to include the rest of the countries, especially the 9 riparian countries, and not to involve Ethiopia. In order to explain this and many more about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, I've got you a professional in water resources and a PhD candidate at the Florida International University, that is Mekdelawit Messay. Thank you for blessing us with your time.
Thank you for having me.
So whoever comes with water resource professional, the first thing that I ask is, what is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam for you?
That's easy. Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the meaning is in its name for me. For me, it means renaissance, right? It is Ethiopia. It is supposed to be Ethiopia's renaissance. It is supposed to be Ethiopia saying no to poverty and undignified life. It's people reclaiming their history. It's people reclaiming their future. It's basically us saying no to poverty, no to undignified life, no to this kind of life that we live, and saying yes to the destiny and the kind of life we are destined for, you know, like a dignified life. It is really the renaissance of Ethiopia. If we do manage to finish it and manage it properly, it has the potential to transform the country significantly. So it is the renaissance of the country. That's what it means to me.
So my next question is with regards to the agreements in the timeline. I want you to give us the holistic timeline. I've heard you in one of the rooms on Twitter explaining everything about the timeline, and there's one quote that came out from you with the 70%. I've used it in one of my interviews and it came out good. So I want you to give us the holistic view of the agreements that is the colonial agreements that came out with pioneership of Egypt and Sudan in order to come up with agreements of the Nile Basin. Tell us about the timeline and everything that happened. The 1929, the 1959, the CFA and everything.
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about agreements on the Nile, it just doesn't start with the 1929 or the 1959. It goes back all the way to 1891. And these agreements were not necessarily always between Egypt and Sudan, but they were between colonial powers at the time. That would be the UK, France, Italy, sometimes Belgium too, in the Congo. And these countries either would have like a bilateral, a trilateral agreement between the colonial powers, or after some countries became free, like after Egypt became free in 1922 and Sudan became free in 1956, they would have bilateral or trilateral agreements between themselves. But like the whole idea, the whole theme behind these agreements is to ensure all of the total flow of the Nile reaches Egypt, and then later on some part of that water would be used in Sudan. So that's the single common thread between all of these agreements, even if we start from 1891. There were earlier agreements that the British, especially pioneered by the British, that were very aggressively securing the amount of water that would reach Egypt, that would reach Egypt. And this was not for the sake of Egypt per se, but to ensure the colonial interests in Egypt. So back in the day, the British had huge cotton plantations in Egypt, right? So without the waters of the Nile continuously flowing to Egypt, these cotton plantations wouldn't thrive, and that would mean the textile factories back in London, right, in Europe, would suffer. So it was really imperative for the British to ensure that the water of the Nile kept flowing to Egypt, was not interrupted, and the amount would not decrease, right? So this is the common thread. So it starts from 1891, for example, when they agreed with Italy to ensure that no water of the Tekeze River, because Italy was back then in control of Eritrea, and so no water of the Tekeze River would be thrown away and that it would freely flow to Egypt, right? And then a series of agreements from then on up until the 1929 agreement, and then the 1959 agreement comes in, right? So there are a series of agreements which essentially want to ensure the total flow of the Nile always reach Egypt without fail, right? Why we focus on the 1929 and the 1959 agreements is because they put numbers on these claims, so to say. So 1929 agreement, for example, was the first time they actually numerically divided the flow of the Nile. So the 1929 agreement allocates 48 billion cubic meters of water for Egypt and 4 billion cubic meters of water to Sudan, right? So this is the first time they actually numerically divided the waters between two countries, right? And the same thing, the same story with the 1929 agreement. It was an agreement that was signed between the UK and Egypt, actually. So the story here was in 1929, Egypt was a free country, technically. So when the UK wanted to expand their agricultural exploits to Sudan, which was then under the colonial rule of the UK, they had to sort of ask Egypt to use part of the water, which historically used to be completely used in Egypt, right? So as part of their like goodwill or their agreement with Egypt, they wanted to take some of the Nile water, 4 billion cubic meters, that is, but they wanted to reach and agree to increase their agricultural exploits in Sudan. They got into an agreement, right? So that agreement actually says, if the details of that agreement says that any exploits in Sudan cannot touch the natural rights, the natural and historical rights of Egypt, that this agricultural expansions would not injure the security of Egypt, all of that stuff. In addition to that, this 1929 agreement sort of gave a veto power to Egypt to basically turn down any upstream repair and upstream infrastructure, which would potentially pose a threat towards the water security or the water flowing towards Egypt, right? So that's where like numerically dividing the water in the Nile started. Before that, it was all wordly agreements, right? Like you don't touch this, you don't touch that. You will make sure water flows freely. I agree to this. I disagree to this. But 1929 actually physically, numerically divided the water. So following on the 1929 agreement, so as I told you, it allocates 48 billion cubic meters to Egypt, 4 billion cubic meters to Sudan. That's 52 billion cubic meters. That's not the whole flow of the Nile. So the total flow of the Nile back in the days measured in Aswan is the southern tip of Egypt, was 84 billion cubic meters. And I knew this, right? So in 1959, they came up with this agreement for the full utilization of the Nile waters, right? So as if this agreement did not disenfranchise the other countries fully, they came up with this agreement saying we should utilize the Nile waters fully. And to do that, they needed to revamp that 1929 agreement. So that's why even though 1959 agreement was signed by two free countries, Sudan was free, Egypt was free in 1959, it was a relic of this 1929 colonial agreement signed between the UK and Egypt. So, and by proxy, we call this one, which is basically a development of a colonial agreement, the 1959 agreement, also a colonial agreement. In any case, the 1959 agreement, the problem with the 1959 agreement, again, starts with its name. It says for the full utilization of the Nile waters. And it's signed between two countries, again, Sudan and Egypt, to fully utilize the Nile waters. And according to this agreement, as I mentioned earlier, the flow of the Nile measured at Aswan is 84 billion cubic meters. So they divided this fuller flow of the Nile, 84 billion cubic meters, between the two countries. That allocates 55.5 billion cubic meters for Egypt, so slightly higher than the 48 billion cubic meters they got, and 18.5 billion cubic meters for Sudan, which is significantly higher than the 4 billion cubic meters they got, right? And then the rest, 10 billion cubic meters, is left for evaporation. If you add this up, it would amount to 84 billion cubic meters. So this agreement only works under the assumption that one, all the flow of the water reaches Egypt and Sudan, right? So that means no upstream consumption, no upstream use, no upstream utilization of the Nile water. And two, that the Nile completely belongs to these countries. That's what the implication is, right? Dividing it between themselves. And there was even foresight in the sense of thinking about evaporation, right? But there was no foresight in the sense of acknowledging the rights of these other countries. The agreement actually has an article in it which says, should any question by these other upstream riparian countries come up, right, to use the water, they would form a joint committee, very conveniently comprised of Egyptian and Sudanese professionals, that would actually see if the question of water use is justified. That in itself is a big breach of sovereignty, right? Like questioning the water use of upstream countries and basically making it subservient to the goodwill of this commission, which is essentially composed of Sudanese and Egyptian professionals. And so if this commission deems the question to be correct, then Sudan and Egypt would sort of cater for that demand by equally sort of deducting the water needs from their shares, right? So the implication of this is that these other upper riparian countries don't have shares. If they do ask it, and if we deem it right, we'll give them part of our share, right? So it's
there's even a commission. There's
exactly.
Even a commission in order to sort this out.
Yeah, so like, it not only divides the total waters of the Nile between the two countries, it by proxy disenfranchises the full rights, the natural rights of these other upstream riparian countries, including Ethiopia, which happens to supply 86% of the Nile waters, and all the other upstream equatorial countries, which are the sources of the Nile water. And also this 1959 agreement by proxy sort of extends the veto power that the 1929 agreement gave to Egypt, right? So it gives Egypt and Sudan the rights basically to say yes or no to any upstream project that would potentially endanger the water security or the water rights of Egypt and Sudan, which is basically any project, because they are using the whole of the pie, right? They're using the entire flow of the Nile right now. So let it be it hydropower, be it a small irrigation, any kind of project is going to affect the whole, because they're entirely using the whole of the water. So that's basically why there's so much focus on this 1959 agreement. And also because since then, there hasn't been any significant agreement that tackles the issue of water allocation. We've had the 1993 agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia, where we conceptually agreed to use the waters of the Nile equitably and not to cause significant harm, but there is no mention of a reallocation of the water. And of course, there's the CFA, which basically failed. No, I wouldn't say it failed, but which is basically on a standstill because of the reluctance of Egypt and Sudan to sign it after dealing with this, after fully negotiating on it for 13 years. And then if we're talking about project-based agreements, there's the DOP, the Declaration of Principles on the GERD, but that's not a basin-wide water allocation agreement, right? It's particularly for the GERD. So there hasn't been any significant agreement to sort of bypass the skewed arrangement. The CFA would have been the one to do it, but it's on a standstill because Egypt and Sudan have not signed it, basically. So that's why it's one of the most significant agreements in the basin. It's not because these upstream riparian countries or Ethiopia are bounded by it per se, because we didn't sign it. And as per international law, any third party will only be subject to a legal regime if they willingly and freely enter into it and sign it, right? Ethiopia was a free country, did not sign it. Ethiopia has been showing that, or like continuously showing that we do not agree to it, we dissent to it, and we like the notes and the memos from Ethiopia actually had the foresight to say any future project that we do will not be subject to restraints by this agreement, right? By this 1959 agreement. The other upstream riparian countries, even though back then they were under British rule, and so this is the Egyptian argument, right? So they were under British rule, so the British signed it. So by proxy, it still applies to you. They completely rejected. So it's not because this 1959 agreement is so much binding on Ethiopia and the other upstream riparian countries, but it's because it's not. We don't really. It means nothing to us, but it's because of the implications that the agreement has that this agreement is so important in the basin. I think we'll talk about it later, but this agreement has far-reaching implications. It's seeping into science. Those numbers that the 1959 agreement states are being used by the UN, by scientific research institutions as a basis for doing science, as a basis for doing allocations, simulations, and everything, which means it's messing up the future as well, right? And so it's not because it's binding on us, especially on Ethiopia. It's not. We don't care about this agreement. It does not affect us per se legally, right? But the implications of the agreement complicate things and make things in the Nile extremely convoluted and extremely difficult to solve. And that's why this one, the 1959, and by proxy, the 1929 becomes really important in the basin.
Amazing. Well said, powerful statements. Once again, our focus today is the 1959 agreement, which the Egyptians and the Sudanese go back whenever they want to state something. So I want you to focus on that 1959 agreement. And what is exactly the intent of that 1959 agreement? And what are the ramifications of the 1959 agreement? I want you to explain it to our audience.
Okay. The intent of the 1959 agreement, the spirit of that law is in the name, full utilization of the Nile water. That's the whole intent. They want to utilize the Nile waters fully, right? And that in itself is a problem, right?
Sure.
Like as if the 1929 agreement, which allocated significant amounts of the Nile water between two countries, was not enough, seeking to fully utilize a river that you basically contribute nothing to and completely disregarding the rights and fair shares of the other 9 riparian countries, which happen to be the source of the complete source of the water, is very disrespectful in the sense of disregarding the sovereignty and the rights of these other countries, right? And it's also inconsiderate in the sense that you're planning, you're codifying a law that uses the complete amount of the Nile water, which comes at the cost of these other countries not using it, right? So the intent or the spirit of the law is the full utilization of the river. That's where the problem happens, right? It's not full utilization of our share or their share. No, there's no share. It's full utilization of the river, right? And second thing, it's not holistic. You have a basin with 11 riparian countries, but then again, the 2 downstreammost countries, which basically contribute nothing to except a few Sudanese rivers, which contribute nothing to the water, you have them here agreeing on an agreement to fully utilize the river, which really doesn't make sense, right? So, and that's where the implication starts. Okay, so they totally divide the water. The water use is unsustainable. Water use, the water efficiency in Sudan and Egypt. Most of the water is used for irrigation, and there's mostly what we call flood irrigation in Sudan and Egypt, right? Where you just flood your field, and a lot of water is wasted. This is not the most efficient use of the water per se. When you think about excuse me, when you think about the kind of crops that they grow very water intensive crops in arid areas like cotton, alfalfa, sugarcane. This is not a very water smart decision, right? Like a country which is worried about water scarcity,
retail market is
says we don't
to
have a
see
lot of
if
water,
there are ways
should not
to ease
technically
the
be
pressure
growing
on
these
fuel
kinds of
prices.
water-thirsty crops
Parliament has
in
been
the middle
told that
of
the government
desert, right? But that is what's happening, and that would be all fair, well and okay if they had been using their fair share of the water. No country has the right to say do this or do that to another sovereign country, right? So had they been using their fair share, we would not be having this conversation. But because they're utilizing their entire water, part of our share goes there and is being wasted, right? We can talk about infrastructures in Egypt and Sudan. These are desert countries with very high evaporation rate. For example, if you take the Aswan High Dam, which was actually built to enhance the 1959 agreement, they actually shared the benefits of the Aswan High Dam, something around 22 billion cubic meters. That addition is the one that's divided between the two countries on top of their 1929 shares, which sort of raises the allocations to the numbers that we know from the 1959 agreements, right? But just from evaporation loss, the Aswan High Dam loses 10 to 15 billion cubic meters of water every single year. That's because of inconsiderate projects, right? Like projects that are not sustainable, projects that are not meant to be built in the areas they were built. These are not efficient projects. These are not efficient infrastructures. They're just there because of lack of collaboration and cooperation and integrated planning throughout the basin, right? So there's that, the use part of it. But then again, like I mentioned, the 1959 agreement or the numbers in the 1959 agreement only happen if and only if this upstream riparian countries absolutely use nothing from the waters. And that has been the case for a very long time, right? Which is why we see a lot of famine, a lot of drought, a lot of poverty, and a lot of unfortunate things in these upstream riparian countries because they have not been using their resources, right? So the first implication is by its very nature, by the fact that it's there, it disenfranchises the other upstream riparian countries from our fair share, from their fair shares, right? So that goes against international law, because international law says every single basin state, right, riparian state, by virtue of it being in the basin, is entitled to a fair share. That does not mean equal share, a fair share, equitable share. That equitable share.
Let me intervene here. There's one thing that they inculcate in the 1959 agreement. That is the words that is the uninterrupted natural flow of water. Historical rights, the rights that they need to have. I mean, is this something that we deem possible in the international water laws? Yeah. Because there's something that we expect to be right and correct, but they're at the same time try to come up with these confusing words, which are still continuing to happen now and again whenever we talk about the agreement.
Yeah. Well, international lawyers will tell you there's no such term as historical rights or historical use in the narrative or in the dictionary of international law. So there's a term for you which doesn't really have any meaning as far as international law is concerned. So as you rightly mentioned, that word means nothing. It just means they want to ensure what the kind of use they were used to, which doesn't really have any basis under the law. So like you said, it's by repeating these terms over and over again, they have it ingrained in the media narrative, in the social narrative, political narrative, even in scientific narratives. But as far as the law is concerned, there is no such thing as historical law in the dictum of international law. Natural flow or uninterrupted flow, that is a hydrological term. It just means the uninterrupted, as the name says, uninterrupted flow of the river. And it's very inconsiderate to expect that when the water comes after crossing 9 countries. It's very unrealistic to expect uninterrupted flow of the river to reach Egypt and Sudan. Again, that basically means these upstream countries do not do anything to the water, not dam it, not use it consumptively, anything, right? And so you rightly pointed out, like, these words, even like the words that are being used in the agreement or in discussions surrounding the agreement, they are as detrimental as the agreement itself, right?
True, very powerful. At the same time, as a scientist, there is one question that I like to ask you. Scientists and researchers, now and again, they use the 1959 agreement as a baseline for their research and their studies. Exactly. Don't you think this is truly condescending And as a scientist user, how can we change this?
That is the $1,000,000 question in a way, because I can understand where the scientists are coming from, because as a scientist, as a researcher, especially as a researcher outside the basin, maybe you just want to publish your paper, maybe you just want to finish your research, right? So it might not be such a big concern for them to think about the ramifications of using this 1959 agreement as a basis for scientific research. So they, like, to be fair to the scientists and to the researchers this far, they are in a very difficult situation, right? It's difficult to find a baseline situation where all parties agree on, because we don't have an understanding of what fair and equitable use is in the basin, right? So it's like the next best thing or the next easy thing is to default on what's already there, even though it's very skewed. So I can sort of understand where they're coming from, but that does not make it right. It is not absolutely not correct, absolutely not right to use the skewed basis or status quo as a basis for any kind of research, right? That just means you're entrenching the notion of this agreement, the implications of this agreement into the scientific narrative, which is very, very detrimental. But then it's the agreement, it's the political stalemate, it's the political environment that has pushed scientists to a corner, basically, right? So if we had another baseline, right, another equitable and reasonable water share between the countries, this wouldn't even be a question, right? And then we could use that as a basis for simulations. But right now, because we don't have that, and because not everybody is willing to, like, it's very hard to even think, simulate, or like dream up a scenario of how water use in the basin would be, because we and all the international community are so used to using this agreement as a basis for everything. If you go to the UN website, which has like the internal and external water resources of all the countries, the 55.5 billion cubic meters that Egypt gets annually from the Nile is part of their surface water resource, right? So we're not talking about individual scientists here, like at the level of the UN, right? There's this website is freely available. You can see part of the surface water resource of Egypt includes the 55.5 billion cubic meters that they are supposedly entitled to according to this agreement. So it's very entrenched in the political, social, even scientific narrative, but it's something that has to be absolutely changed, and calling it out and showing what that means and the repercussions of what the repercussions of using that agreement in scientific simulations and scientific studies are could be a right step, and could be a right step in the forward, I suppose. It doesn't mean it's going to change anytime soon. I mean, scientists are still going to use this agreement because there is nothing else, but there is this desperate need to have another basis, another status quo, right? Because what happens now is most of this research, especially like take GERD, like, right? Most of the research that is being done in the Nile these days is about GERD. Let's say a research is talking about what the implications of GERD will be on Sudan and Egypt, right? When they talk about reduced water flow to Egypt and Sudan, it's compared to the 55.5 and the 18.5 that they would have got historically, right? Which these numbers, we know that they are derived from the 1959 agreement. And there might be different words, like it's not necessarily historical rights or historical use or historical flow. They might say existing flow. Even existing use in these countries is predicated by the 1959 agreement, right? So that's how far entrenched this agreement is in social, political, and scientific arenas. And that's why we have to keep talking about it, calling it out, right? So everybody's aware of the implications of this agreement.
All right. My final question goes like this. Looking forward, what should be the right way in order to bring back the reality of the pillars of the transboundary water usage. That includes the equitable and reasonable use, not causing significant harm, and being bound to cooperation. What should be the reliable way in order to go forward?
Well, the first thing is getting rid of this 1959 agreement. That has to go. It has to be scrapped. And the easiest way to do that is actually to ratify the CFA, right? So that would supersede any historical agreements and would actually enforce the principles of equitable and reasonable use in the basin. And then we can start from there to formulate some kind of equitable and reasonable arrangement, right? So that has to be the way forward. Technically, basically in the Nile Basin, we have two routes. Either we go the cooperation route and get rid of this 1959 agreement and come up with an equitable and reasonable water use scheme, or every country will continue using the water unilaterally. And this is going to be more extreme in the upper riparian countries because we all know population is growing. Ethiopia has the largest population now. And it's not just in Ethiopia. All these upstream riparian countries also have growing population. With growing population, there is an increase in water demand, right? There's more need for agricultural water, industrial water, municipal water, right? We're going to need more water. The economies of these countries are developing, so that's also going to need more water. Food security is always an issue in these countries, and we have already seen that rain-fed agriculture is not going to be sufficient, so there is going to be more need for irrigation. And without an agreement, if we forge ahead, and if every country unilaterally develops its water resources, as they possibly would, what's going to happen is consumptive water needs in these upstream riparian countries is going to increase, and they're going to start using part of the Nile water, which would mean less water to Sudan and Egypt downstream, right? So it's actually in the interest of these downstream riparian countries to be proactive and to seek equitable and reasonable use, because they're the ones who have a lot to lose should countries continue to develop unilaterally, right? And this is what the GERD basically signifies for other countries as well. It's the willingness to take control of your destiny, your resources, and utilize them, right? And that's what they're going to do, because they will be forced by the population demand, the increased water demand, the economic demand. There's not to mention there's climate change, which is going to make water resources, the quantity, the quality, the timing, all of that very unpredictable, right? So when all these stressors come together, countries are not going to have any other option but to use the water resources at their disposal. And that would mean more withdrawal upstream, right? More consumptive use. Forget about dams, forget hydropower projects. There's going to be more consumptive use upstream, right? Which would definitely mean less water for Sudan and Egypt in the long term. So that's actually in the interest of these downstream riparian countries to actually be proactive, let go of this colonial relic, let go of this unsustainable status quo, and actually move forward towards an integrated, sustainable water use management. Because the water of the Nile is a long river. It's the longest river in the world, but it's not the biggest river in the world. The flow of the Nile water compared to other transboundary river basins is very, very low, even compared to other river basins in Africa. It's very insignificant. Most research, the 84 billion cubic meters is an old number. Some research raised that number to 94, 95. Best case scenario, let's say we have 100 billion cubic meters of water annually, right? And that's like an overestimation. 100 billion cubic meters of water is not going to be enough to sustain the agricultural, the industrial, municipal, domestic demands, and also environmental demands of all these countries if it is used in piecemeal, right? Like if every country tries to take its portion. The only way forward is to come together and use the water sustainably, to get the most out of the water without this myopic view of myopic view that's like ingrained in the 1959 agreement, or like without this very selfish agreement saying like, no, I have to use all the water. That's not a way forward. And we are going to get to an equitable and reasonable arrangement either way It's just one way it's going to be very difficult and very detrimental to the basin. The other way is going to be collaborative, cooperative, and it would take less time. And we would be proactive in the sense that we would get ahead of all the problems that we would be facing forward in terms of sustainability, climate change, all of the things that the future is going to build. So we only have one future. There has to be a better and equitable, reasonable, and integrated water use regime throughout the basin. That's the only way we can sustain to manage our growing population. Well, there's no way around that.
Thank you very much, Mekdelawit, for all the blessings, for all the explanations. I've learned a lot. I'm truly, truly honored to have you here. And this has been the edition inside the special course that we focused on the 1959 agreement, which is biased, which is partial, and which is not significant, not only to Ethiopia, to the 9 riparian countries too. Thank you once again, Mekdelawit. And
thank you so much for having me.
God bless everyone, and do stay tuned for more from ETV.